Yeah, good morning everybody. I'm really very thankful for the invitation and for this very warm welcome from the side of David, where is he? And of course from Gayatri. And I must say, I also feel a little bit at home here, I must say to David, because Italian has become my second language. I'm studying not only Gramsci for such a long time, but we have many Italian immigrants in Frankfurt, and I have become a friend of many of them during the 70s. We occupied houses together and so on. So I've partly become Italian and also stay a lot of time near Rome every year, while translating, of course, Gramsci. And also Giorgio is a friend, has been a friend for many, many years. So I'm very happy to stay here with all of you and with those I already know for many years and those I get to know today. Gayatri, I just say one sentence. Gayatri, it shows that we are very young women both, starting with a new project today. Okay, so let me talk about this complicated issue, revolution, defeat, and subalternity. I didn't bring a PowerPoint presentation because I have lots of, I think, very beautiful quotations, and I want you just to listen to them, so I will read it carefully. I want to say before that when I quote Antonio Gramsci in English, I am, of course, relying on the wonderful edition of Frank Rosengarten of the letters. This, at the time, has been the most complete edition of the letters at all, and the translation is very beautiful, and your comments till today are the most useful I always rely on. And for the quotations of the two women, I have to rely on myself, unfortunately. So I had to translate them from Italian to English, and of course, if we publish, we have to look at it again. But for the moment, it's my translation. So let's start. As Gayatri already said, in many books on Gramsci, we find the claim that his term subaltern was not a new and fundamental category of his writings, but just a cipher for the word working class or peasant masses. And that only with a later translation of the term into post-colonial studies in India and Latin America would it acquire its new, broader meaning. I think this claim can be refuted by an examination of Gramsci's dialogue with his wife Giulia Schucht and Giulia's sister Tatiana in the prison letters, which in this paper will also be connected in some points with considerations put forward in the prison notebooks. I want to put one text into the one core text into the middle of this paper. I will refer to it several times. It is a letter written by Gramsci on August 8, 1933. A letter which he writes to his wife Giulia Schucht, which shows that he himself, Gramsci, uses the concept of the subaltern to capture a certain self-positioning of artists and intellectuals like Giulia as a member of the post-revolutionary society, then in 1933, Stalinist society in Russia. And now the quotation. In general, however, it seems to me, says Gramsci, that you, Giulia, put yourself, and not only in this connection, in a subaltern rather than a dominant position. And in Italian, it's still clearer. nella posizione del subalterno e non del dirigente. That is, you assume the position of someone incapable of historically criticizing ideologies by dominating them, explaining and justifying them as a historical necessity of the past. Of someone, he speaks again to Giulia, of someone who, brought into contact with a specific world of emotions, feels attracted or repulsed by it, remaining always within the sphere of emotion and immediate passion. End of quote. So, many difficult questions arise. What is the specific world of emotions Gramsci refers to? What does it represent in the exact historical context of his time? What does it mean for Gramsci to see Giulia in a subaltern position? What did it mean on other occasions, as he says? What is the meaning of immediate passion in different spheres of life? How do Giulia herself and her sister Tatiana Schucht interpret Gramsci's view of Giulia's personality and self-positioning during his time in prison at the beginning of the years of Stalinist terror? Giulia wrote more than 80 letters. Her sister Tatiana wrote even more than 600 letters to Gramsci during the years 27 to 33. Most of them, Tatiana, with the aim of connecting Gramsci with his wife and his children, and to continue and heal an often interrupted dialogue. For about 50 years, the letters of Giulia and Tatiana were not present in the different Gramsci editions, despite the fact that most of them were to be found in the Gramsci archive in Rome. They were just there, and nobody referred to them. It was Mimma Pauleso Quercioli, Gramsci's niece, who for the first time published a selection of Giulia's letters. This was in 87. Aldo Natoli finally edited in 1997, together with Chiara Daniele, the correspondence between Antonio Gramsci and Tatiana Schucht, the whole correspondence. The correspondence from prison with both of the Schucht sisters, as Gayatri said, is for the first time being edited in 3 volumes in Germany, starting in 1994. And we are now preparing the 3rd volume. This will be the years from 31 ongoing. It is the aim of this paper to describe not only Gramsci's fear about the possible subaltern position of his wife Giulia in the Soviet Union, but also his own struggle against becoming a subaltern as a prisoner of Mussolini. At the same time, it is an analysis of gendered concepts of autonomy and self-construction in Gramsci's dialogue with Giulia and Tatiana. In order to unfold the category of subalternity in Gramsci's prison letters, I want to follow his own historicist method, as he called it, and in this way try to analyze hermeneutically some crucial parts of his correspondence. I will present these interpretations in the context of the biographies of the persons involved and their political involvement during Gramsci's prison years. So I come to my first point, the Schucht family, a specific world of emotions. Antonio Gramsci met Giulia Schucht for the first time in the sanatorium The Silver Forest, Serebriano Por, near Moscow in 23. He was then a member of the Italian delegation to the Communist International. At the same time, Giulia Schucht's sister Eugenia was, like Gramsci, taking the cure at Serebriano Por because of psychic exhaustion. Eugenia was the first member of the Schucht family that Gramsci had got to know. Like Giulia and her sister Anna, she was a very gifted person and had studied in Rome at the Academy of Fine Arts. Gramsci had established a friendship with her while staying in the sanatorium, since She understood Italian and was happy to refresh her memories of Rome. She was suffering from nervous illness. She was for a period even unable to walk. After exhausting activity, first as a teacher in a Jewish school in Warsaw in 1912, and afterwards as an elementary teacher in Moscow during the revolutions of 1917. She was a Bolshevist activist from the very beginning and a personal friend of Lenin's wife, Krupskaya. Giulia Schucht, who was born and grew up in Geneva, where the family was in exile, had completed her studies as a violinist at the Santa Cecilia Conservatory in Rome. When Gramsci got to know her, the family had returned to Russia, and she was giving recitals in the Serebryanibor Sanatorium and teaching at the College of Music in Ivanovo-Voznesensk, near Moscow. During the period that Gramsci spent in Moscow in 23-24, she gave up artistic work in favor of so-called revolutionary praxis, as she called it, doing secretarial work for the local section of the Communist Party. Gramsci would never accept this narrow bureaucratic definition of revolutionary performance. We will see this later on. However much Gramsci respected the revolutionary Schucht family, Apollon Schucht had been a friend of Lenin's since his exile in Geneva. Gramsci opposed from the very beginning the atmosphere within the family, which was based too much for his taste on Rousseauian spontaneism rather than on solidarity. This, in his view, was the reason for the lack of autonomy and encouragement Giulia received to develop her autonomous artistic personality. Together with the spirit of Geneva, this was how Gramsci always described the family characteristics, Gramsci criticized every form of revolutionary romanticism. In Giulia's father Apollon, whose descent was from a family of German aristocrats, who got high positions as an officer in the Russian army, but later on disagreed with the Tsar, joined the Narodniki, and was confined to Siberia together with his family. In this father, Gramsci found that political avant-garde went well together with a patriarchal attitude in front of the women of the family. Gramsci loved very much Giulia's mother, a born Giulia Hirschfeld, who came from a very renowned family of Jewish lawyers assimilated in Russia. The person around whom the problematic relations within the family revolve and which are extremely repressive for Giulia is mainly Eugenia. When Gramsci was staying in Moscow after the birth of Giulia's and his son Delio in April 1925, the first problems surfaced. Eugenia liked to play the role of the mother of Delio and pressurized Giulia into not accepting money from Gramsci for the child's upbringing. It was this episode in particular, the refusal of the family to accept his role as father with any seriousness, which Gramsci recollected with pain on many occasions in his prison letters. It seems, however, that Gramsci does not see the full significance of Giulia's terrible trapped situation. When Giulia followed Gramsci to Rome in autumn 1925, Eugenia came along too. It was she who looked after Delio when Giulia was working at the Soviet embassy. Giulia stood aside, as her Roman friend Nilde Perilli remembered. Now we come to Tatiana. Tatiana Schucht, by Gramsci also often called Tanya. She lived alone in Rome as a teacher of natural science. She had studied natural science and medicine in Rome and had not returned to Russia because she did not want to succumb to the family regime. She was a really impressive person, very autonomous in any sense of the word. Gramsci immediately saw in her a friend and ally when he got to know her in 1925, before Giulia came to Rome with her son Delio. Tatiana was very upset by the strange family constellation she was confronted with. Later, in a long letter to Gramsci dated December 28, 1930, she was to recollect from her memories of Giulia's stay in Rome during the year 25-26. She writes, I quote her, that I know I had really bad days then, always in intense nervous tension that at least some natural rights would be respected. Unquote. Eugenia taught Delio to call his father Dядя, uncle, until Tanya intervened forcefully. It was at Eugenia's insistence that Giulia returned to Moscow. She didn't want to. She wanted to stay with Gramsci. Before the second child, Giuliano, was born in August 1926. When Giulia fell ill with psychopathic symptoms after the birth of the child, Eugenia took over Delio's upbringing, while Giulia spent many months in different sanatoriums. Letters from Gramsci to Giulia were not passed on. The presumptuous responsibility of the family for all its members becomes repressive because it is exercised arbitrarily on the one hand and imbued with authority on the other. This is the case in the family's behavior towards Giulia, as becomes clear by the end of 1930 at latest. Gramsci writes, "Now I'm afraid that my letters don't reach you and that yours too go astray." I come to my second point, the context. The historical context of this family atmosphere. The rejection of Gramsci's political concepts by the Communist International and the involvement of the Schucht family. On October 14, 26, less than a month before his arrest, Gramsci had sent a letter to the Central Committee of the CPSU in which he took a very clear and fearless position against the sectarianism in the Soviet Party under Stalin's majority, especially the attacks on Trotsky. Gramsci was not a Trotskyist in his political beliefs. For example, he had supported the doctrine of the socialism in one country, but he held Trotsky in great esteem and admonished the majority of the Soviet Party as follows. And here comes a quotation from this very important letter. He writes to Stalin, "Unity and discipline cannot be mechanistic and obtained by force. They must be honest, based on conviction, and we want to be sure that the majority of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union does not intend to win a total victory and avoids extreme measures." Unquote. This letter was never passed on to Stalin by Togliatti, but nevertheless they all knew the letter, of course. All the Central Committee knew the letter. The letter provoked the split between Gramsci and Togliatti, and at the same time between Gramsci and the majority of the Italian Communist executive. From this moment, Gramsci was viewed within the Third International as a Trotskyist, which meant also his isolation among the Italian political prisoners. From 1928 onwards, Gramsci suspected that the Italian Communist Party had deliberately or through gross negligence contributed to his long prison sentence in the run-up to the Rome trials. There are several letters where he refers to this. Gramsci's situation deteriorated dramatically after the party confirmed the radical left-wing course of the Third International with its turn in 1929, and abandoned the political line crafted by Gramsci after the conquest of Lyon. The fact now that Giulia ceased writing to him for some months at precisely this point must have been highly alarming for him. Why did Giulia stop writing to Gramsci for several months at exactly the moment when he had been sentenced to 20 years in prison? It is unfortunate that that many of Giulia's letters got lost. Letters from 30, 31, 32, but some of the letters had been found by Aldo Natoli. He gave them to me, and I found especially interesting one from March 16, 1932, where Giulia wrote to him, "I was not active over a long time." Or, excuse me, no, if I was not active over a long time, if I tried to find strength in passivity when you had been arrested, then I must find an explanation for this, and I must find a way to change this state, to come out of it. There are moments in which I do not understand one word. Dear, I should and could tell you today more than ever. When I think about the reciprocal help we were able to give one another during our life together, I feel an immense pain. Also formally, I did not tell you many things which I was almost afraid even to think. Love me, Giulia. What can these mysterious sentences tell us today in the context of the documents from the Soviet archives published after the end of the Soviet Union? The most recent historical study by Angelo Rossi and Giuseppe Vacca, entitled Gramsci Between Mussolini and Stalin, states clearly that, I'm quoting them, from December 1924, Giulia Schucht worked for the NKVD, for the Secret Service. Also, if her work was only bureaucratic, her life was from that time subjected to special supervision and censorship. At that time, this might have been lived as normal in 24, not creating particular problems. But evidently, this symmetric relation between public and private life had to crack with Gramsci's imprisonment and was totally abolished between 28 and 30. There cannot be other than political explanations for this. The control of Giulia had been progressively transformed into paralyzing restrictions. In her letter of June 6, 1930, Tanyas Schucht had decided to inform Gramsci about Giulia's situation by copying a letter from her father Apollon, that it was not only Giulia's psychological disturbance, which Gramsci already knew about in rough outline, which prevented her from writing to him. Apollon writes, "I did not say," and Tatiana transcribes it for Gramsci, "I did not say that Giulia does not write because she is sick. I said she writes only rarely because she finds it difficult to do so in the circumstances in which she is compelled to write." Apollon Schucht cannot be more explicit about the surveillance and control of Giulia, but there is a document written by Togliatti and published by Paolo Spriano which clearly highlights these circumstances. And I quickly make reference to this. Piero Sraffa, the Gramsci's friend from the times of the Ordine Nuovo, and later on Keynes' collaborator, he remained friend to Gramsci during the prison years, and besides Tatiana gave him all the help, and he also visited the family, and he saw that Giulia wanted to to write to Gramsci that she had lots of letters in her bag, but that she had to deliver all these letters to an office, and the office kept the letters for months and sometimes didn't send them at all. Gramsci's inner calm is deeply disturbed not only by the political developments in the Soviet Union, but also through not knowing whether Giulia is capable of fighting against the pressures, or whether she has already succumbed to inner resignation. Tanya writes, and this is really a remarkable sentence, to Gramsci in May 30. In any case, I think, as I have already written to you, that Giulia has no one to give her strength. Her situation must be terrible. No one wants or is able to encourage in her a gentler attitude towards you as the father of her children and as her husband. Unquote. Gramsci finally gets a picture about the situation in Moscow from this letter sent by Tanya at the end of December 1930. Very gradually he begins to realize that Eugenia's behavior is more than just the quirks of a sick person, but involves the political and moral isolation of Giulia, which must be rooted in his own, Gramsci's person, and which indicates that Gramsci's own political isolation is threatening to destroy the bonds within his family. Thus, I'm asking, how does Gramsci describe the manifestations of Giulia's subaltern position? Firstly, it seems that Gramsci saw the manifestation of this positioning in Giulia's pedagogical principles. I come now to the third point, that putting oneself in a subaltern position means for Gramsci also a question of pedagogy, and I would add there is a strong gender aspect in how Gramsci describes the situation. Let's go back to the letter I already quoted, this letter from August 8, 33. Gramsci's letter is directly addressed to his wife Giulia, but indirectly answers to a letter from his son Delio, transcribed by Tanya. Delio writes, "Dear Babbo, you ask me whether I have got Pinocchio. No. But I would like to read Mowgli and Rikki-Tikki-Tavi. Papa sent me the book Uncle Tom's Cabin." Gramsci's reaction is very strange, not only critical, but really negative. He responds, "I don't know whether it is a good idea to send Delio the book by Beecher Stowe. He has probably heard some general talk about it as a great book, and I won't deny that for the old generations it may seem to be that, since the memory of reading it is necessarily mixed up with the memory of a world of feelings that at one time were alive and operated, but I think today are quite dead because they have become anachronistic. I myself as a boy was never able to enjoy this tearful concoction filled with Quaker sentimentality that's entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin." In the above-mentioned letter, this is from August 8, 3 months later after this quotation, Gramsci again takes up the same topic about Uncle Tom's Cabin. "I would like to know why Delio got the idea of reading this book, and whether, when he receives it, somebody will explain it to him historically by setting the religiosity and emotions with which this book is permeated in their proper time and place. This seems to me a very difficult task to do for a boy, to do it seriously, of course, and not with the usual generalizations and commonplaces. All the more since you yourself, I think, are not very apt to this." To Giulia. This is really a provocation. therefore, I not only in a first step want to reconstruct the pedagogical aim that Gramsci seems to be developing with this sentence on the surface of his argumentation, but then I want to go deeper and see why he is blaming Giulia in advance for not being able to follow this methodological line of a pedagogy that is not anachronistic. I go therefore back to the very beginning of their existence, Gramsci's and Giulia's, as a family. In a letter from Rome dated October 6, 1924, 2 months after the birth of their son Delio, Gramsci refers in a light, humorous tone to this topic, replying to the inability of Giulia to deal with this, replying to a letter from Giulia in which she proudly reports of the new Soviet laws transferring the custody of children not only to the father and mother, but also to the society as a whole. He answers skeptically, "Do you know that that seems to me more like Rousseau than Lenin? Do you really believe that the best of all communist societies can fundamentally change individual relationships?" And then he jokingly adds the picture of the diligent nurse who cares for all the babies in a hospital ward in order to distribute them from a large carriage to the mothers with the comment, quote, that perhaps they give the mothers a different child each time, since Soviet discipline is so perfect. For Gramsci, the core of Giulia's concept of pedagogical practice lies in what he calls the Genevan breaks within the Schucht family, which for him are reminiscent of Rousseau, the need to express feelings spontaneously without concrete historical analysis and translation into the position of the subject, but then also the counterpart of this spontaneity, namely the idea that both the individual person and the society were capable by nature of responsible action, that education and upbringing are, and now I quote Gramsci, the unraveling of a pre-existing thread. Giulia had written him a letter in December 1929 in which she tried to give him an impression of how far Delio had developed. It seems that Gramsci read this letter very carefully, that he liked it very much, because almost 7 years later, he will be able to recall not only its content, but also its style and spirit. However, when he replied to Giulia, 7 years later, he will say, "Beautiful letter, it cheered me up," and I will quote this later on, but in the situation itself, he says, "It seems to me that Delio's intellectual development, as it appears from what you write to me, is very backward for its age, too infantile." And he many times blamed Giulia for her way bringing up their son. For example, quote, "I've gained the impression that your conception and that of others in your family is too metaphysical. That is, it presupposes that in the child there is potentially the entire man and that one must help it develop what it already contains in a latent form, without coercion, giving free rein to the spontaneous forces of nature or something of the sort. I instead think that man as a whole is an historical formation obtained by coercion, understood not only in its sense of brutality and external violence. To renounce molding the child only means allowing its personality to develop chaotically, accepting all the motives of life from the general environment." Unquote. It is very interesting that the word of intellectual diserror, how he calls this word of upbringing, he means to observe, acquires a gendered meaning for Gramsci in the context of Giulia's interpretations of everyday activities, especially those of the children. And I can bring several quotations for this. On 1st of August 33, Gramsci writes, "I am truly glad that Delio has gone to camp with his schoolmates. I believe that he will acquire intellectual independence and free himself of many tendencies that are morbid, feminine in a pejorative sense." Unquote. Some months earlier, already in 32, end of 32, he had explained his view of womanish education. "I've read with interest your observations on the mirror and about Ludwigs, who loves to look at it at himself. But my interest was aroused by the fact that your reasoning is naively and candidly womanish, the very quintessence of femininity, because seeing a mirror only as a device for narcissism is typical only of women. Your observations are mistaken from top to bottom, and they point to a backward, anachronistic, and terribly dangerous way of reasoning. There is always a Genevan attitude in the depths of your soul, and this is because of a conspicuous part of your psychic uneasiness. I should have been the one to help you to know yourself better. Perhaps it is true that I have been too egoistical and have lived more for the aesthetic sensations than for moral obligations. I believe that I have now become reformed, that in my mind I have reconciled Renaissance and Reformation." Unquote. However, knowing the biographical context of Gramsci's observations, the fact that he sees Eugenia Schucht's influence on the children and mainly on Delio's education, as well as Giulia's inability to free herself from her subordinate position within the family, one must observe that Gramsci here more generally connects the world of immediate emotions with a sense of backward femininity and anachronistic aesthetics. He contrasts this with the masculine world of morality and reformation. He obviously sees the obligation that the family, as well as education and reproduction as a whole, should be organized in the modern world according to rational, historicizing principles. Gramsci criticizes Giulia's pedagogy, thereby failing to appreciate the emotional foundations of her imaginative style of upbringing, as well as the potentially productive effects of psychoanalysis, which he knows hardly anything about, on educational theory. He carps at what Giulia writes in his usual anti-Rousseau tone, but Antonio actually senses that Giulia's praxis is much richer and does not fit into this mold. He himself closes his provocative letter, that I quoted before, with words that show him once again in full possession of his capacity for self-irony and linguistic genius. At the end of this letter, he writes, "Perhaps indeed, most probably, some of my comments are exaggerated or indeed unjust. To reconstruct a megatherium or a mastodon from a tiny bone was Cuvier's special gift, but it may also happen that from a piece of a mouse's tail one might reconstruct a sea serpent." On November 36, he comments retrospectively on Giulia's letter from 7 years ago and identifies his former judgment as dogmatic pedantry. Nevertheless, it is astonishing how precisely he remembers every detail with self-irony and at the same time sticks to his former principle of this construction of personality. He writes, "Most of the time I'm pedantic, that's a pity, without meaning to be." So then, I have to give you this quote. "I've created for myself a formal style under the pressure of events during these 10 years of multiple censorships. I will tell you a small episode to make laugh and to help you understand my state of mind. Once, when Delio was little, you wrote to me a very charming letter in which you wanted to show me how the child was undergoing his initiation into geography and orientation. You described him to me in bed, lying from north to south, saying that the direction of his head, there were population whose carts were drawn by dogs. To his left there was China, to his right Austria, in the line with his legs Crimea, and so on. It seems to me that it's been a long time since you last wrote with such levity. Thus, if Gramsci is so aware of his often one-sidedly critical view of Giulia, caused by his abstract critical analysis of emotions and by setting aside the reality of the emotions themselves, why then, we have to ask, is he so upset about Giulia's supposed inability to teach the children in the right way? Why is he calling her position subaltern? And now I have a much too long text, very interesting. I just wanted to say what I wanted to present here. Giulia and her transcendental error, how Gramsci called it, in giving up her artistic career. And this discussion is so interesting, I find. You will not hear it, because only 5 minutes left, because he here really develops a view of aesthetics that are not anachronistic, that are very, very near of Brecht's Organon at the same time.
You should read a couple of them.
Yeah, we had a seminar just on it in Urbino, where we saw this near, that is so near to Brecht's argumentation. But I had a second point. Gramsci connects this development or not development of her artistic personality with Giulia's psychoanalysis. And I think this is very interesting, as I said, because he is in this part, he wanted to know more about psychoanalysis. Rafa wanted to send him a book of Freud himself, because this would have been very productive. But he never got this book. And so he had to rely on what he read on psychoanalysis in newspapers and journals. And this, of course, was very populist. And he said, he connected then his view of psychoanalysis with the Rousseauan tone. He said, these are the new, especially in Germany with psychoanalysis, we want to reconstruct the new, good, wild creature in the society. And he sees, but he says then, but an active person is not able to take this cure, because an active person has to be the doctor of himself or herself. And this is only something for the humiliated and offended. And then he has very interesting parts where he refers to Dostoevsky and where he says, well, we are in the same situation now in Russia and in the totalitarian states, where the pressure on the individual becomes so high that the individual cannot anymore resist to this pressure. And these people he calls the humiliated and offended, but says, we, Giulia and myself, we cannot be humiliated and offended. We have to put us in a different position. And the next part I would have read would be the part where I now try to show how Tatiana translates Giulia's silences and how Tatiana shows that Giulia's silence is her way of getting out of this political activity and being able to to show solidarity to Gramsci, because as an ill person, she is able to do this. And Gramsci did not get this. He always said she must do it. She must be the doctor of herself. And Tanyas says, no, she cannot do it. And I think this is the great, these are really great letters Tanya writes. And I really would have liked to unfold this more. So, I think I have to read the last thing, and this is the last part, which is the part on atavism and subalternity. Yeah, because Gramsci wants to describe that in his time there is not only a spontaneous reaction on this pressure on the societies, but that there is a new phenomenon that he calls atavism. So Antonio Gramsci and Giulia Schucht are both in subaltern positions. Gramsci as a prisoner of Mussolini's fascist regime, and Giulia as a victim of the molecular changes of the post-revolutionary Soviet society under Stalin. Thus, they are often unable to speak to each other or to hear each other. And this was what Tatiana translated. Gramsci gave his prison notebook 25 on the history of subaltern group the title Ai margini della storia, on the margins of history. He characterizes Giulia's and his own situation in his letter from December 1932 in almost the same words. That you too, albeit in a form much different from mine, for a number of years now have remained in the margins of life's flow and do not know how to plunge in again. Gramsci continues to be concerned about what an individual can do in a situation where state, and I quote, where state coercion of individuals increases and so does the pressure and control. He sees that, quote, for many, the problem can only be solved in a catastrophic manner, since it causes morbid outbursts of repressed passions. And Gramsci asks whether these outbursts can be interpreted as historical atavisms or whether they are already assimilated in social life. Still worse. From the beginning of 32 onwards, Gramsci regularly describes the molecular changes in contemporary societies, and it is impossible not to connect his analysis with the dramatic developments in Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. And now, on March 6, 33, one day only before the severe physical crisis and breakdown, Gramsci writes a letter to Tatiana that in part is identical with his autobiographical notes in paragraph 9 of notebook 15 from 33, from the same time. Here he uses the strongest image that can exist in order to describe the changes he sees in the human relations of his time, the atavism of cannibalism. And he writes, imagine a shipwreck and that a certain number of persons take refuge in a large boat to save themselves. Before the shipwreck, it is quite natural, not one of the future victims thought he would become the victim of a shipwreck, and therefore imagined even less that he would be driven to commit the acts that victims of shipwreck under certain conditions may commit. For example, the act of becoming anthropophagus. Well, as I have told you, a similar change is taking place in me, cannibalism apart. There will no longer be any self-control, and the entire personality will be swallowed by a new individual who has impulses, initiatives, ways of thinking different from the previous ones. In this dramatic image of the anthropophagus, Gramsci describes what the human personality may become under extreme subaltern conditions. There is no doubt that he is referring here to the effects moral terror he speaks about in Notebook 15, outside the prison and on the prisoner inside, and potentially on everybody who finds himself or herself under those conditions of total exclusion from the civil world. However, he still sees a way to overcome this situation of total defeat, which he calls shipwreck. In the same letter from March 6, 1933, he writes to Tatiana that he observed in himself as the shipwrecked a split in the personality. One part of it observes the process, the other suffers it. But the observing part, and as long as this part exists, there is self-control and the possibility of recovery. The observing part senses the precariousness of its position. That is, it foresees that it will reach a point at which its function will disappear. And we can draw a direct connection between this letter of the letter of March 8 and the letter from August 8, which was our core text. In order to understand Gramsci's view of the new subaltern, who is no longer only the worker or the peasant in a capitalist society, all those who live at the margins of society will have to undergo an educational process in order to be capable of historically criticizing ideologies, explaining and justifying them as historical necessity of the past. Now, the conclusions. I do not have to emphasize how much I owe to Gayatri Spivak's work, Can the Subaltern Speak? Without her reading of Gramsci and Indian subaltern studies, I would not have found a key to interpreting Gramsci's letter to Giulia Schucht from 8th of August that we read together. Nor would I have been able to understand Tanyas Schucht's view of her sister Giulia's illness and inability to speak. Spivak makes it clear that subversive speech and subversive silences are depending on hegemonic listening, whereby the listener has the privilege of whether he or she chooses to hear a particular discourse. One of the difficulties, however, of overcoming the situation of not hearing the other's silences is the problem of essentializing subaltern speech. This is also, as I understand it, one of Spivak's main points in describing the situation of the subaltern who tries to be understood. On the one hand, it becomes clear that from her analysis that Gramsci does not follow the Foucauldian way of putting the subaltern in a position to represent their own knowledge and to speak for themselves as the subjects of desire. Gramsci would immediately ask for the analysis of counter-memory by way of reconstructing subaltern history as indispensable experience of determinate times and determinate social positions, different from atavisms in the form of historical regressions to primitive forms of social life. On the other hand, according to Gramsci, the subject put in a subaltern position will not prevent a regression, maybe even to cannibalism, because of an external inner moral law, but rather because of radical historicizing of the conditions of the development of normative orders. This comes very clear in Gramsci's note on Kant's maxim that is also known as the categorical imperative. And here we have really a beautiful link. I quote, "What one can say is," this is from Notebook 11, "that Kant's maxim is connected with his time, with the cosmopolitan Enlightenment and the critical conception of the author. In brief, it is linked to the philosophy of the intellectuals as a cosmopolitan stratum. That is, he must be according to a model which he would like to see diffused among all mankind, according to a type of civilization for whose coming he is working for, whose preservation he is resisting, the forces that threaten its disintegration. Gramsci sees the task of the intellectuals of his time in a similar historicizing way. They have to formulate achievable aims in confronting the historical defeat of the labor movement and the vanishing of the new civiltà the European left had wanted to establish. The consciousness of the defeat is the first step one must take in order to overcome it. It is one of the great merits of Tatiana Schucht's letters to Gramsci that she is able to translate for him the sense of Giulia's illness as an understanding of this defeat, and at the same time to interpret Giulia's immediate expression of feelings toward herself or her children, which is so often blamed and misunderstood by Gramsci, as a way of resisting resignation, also as a way of resisting a gendered understanding of immediate passion in a pejorative sense. Gramsci's last letters to Giulia from Formia and the Quisisana clinic in Rome show that he has become totally aware of the centrality of feeling in his own thoughts and own life. The relation of feelings and reflection has become for him one of the most important issues of the prison notebooks. Without compassion, there is no way of overcoming the position of subalternity. In Gramsci's great critique of Henry de Man, he formulates this principle of intellectual understanding as follows, and this is also the end of the paper. The intellectual's error consists in believing that one can know without understanding, and even more without feeling and being impassioned, not only for knowledge in itself, but also for the object of knowledge. De Man studies popular feelings. He does not feel with them to guide them and lead them into a catharsis of modern civilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. That was, can you hear me? I can hear you. That was, I'm so sorry that I actually had to say that the section on where you would have given quotes on aesthetics and also how Tatiana explained Giulia's silence without only emphasizing in terms of both the inner and outer, as it were, the psychic and the political and so on, if I understood from your sentence. There are many, I will be as brief as possible, and there are many possibilities of discussion worked into our program. I hope you will be able to speak, just as I've told Sven that he has some things to say which in a response might not come out, but he should express them in the discussion areas. I hope you will say more and especially read the quotations. Now, what I will do here is give some points and then turn it over to Joe. First of all, this is completely without pathos now. What I'm trying to think through, and I really need the help of those who know, and to an extent Sven and Luca are on the program. I know them, I don't yet know Lisa and Mika, so I don't quite know how they're going to look at this, but this is not, of course, the traditional philosophical understanding of the Kantian entire structure. But let me put it, and it's sad that I'm only going to say it in a sentence or two, it will seem terribly vulnerable. But if one looks at the idea, and I'm glad that Marshall Brown, a Germanist, has just written me an email saying that he found very moving, this description, in an interview I did with Kathy Carruth, which is published in the current PMLA. So if you want a better articulation, please go and look there. I'm just going to say it in a very clumsy way. If one looks at the entire machinery, the entire machine, if you like, of the Kantian system at work, of course, Kant himself would never agree to what I'm just going to say, a fractured reason. He never would agree to this. But we are readers, and a cat can look at a king. So the idea that that political practical reason is obliged to say freedom, and because the subject cannot access pure reason and must work on the analogies of the sense perception, this idea that there is a certain programmed necessity, as it were, to insist on freedom. If one looks at this structure, then I'm saying this without pathos. I'm not trying to say that Kant should trump Gramsci or anything. If one can't, writing in this way, writing a philosophy of critique which almost brings philosophizing itself to a crisis, so that, and my first conversation with Lucas Tarantino had something of this in there, and there are other philosophers who have looked upon this with some gentleness, I would say, and even commented favorably, that it almost comes to the idea that it is philosophizing itself, which is an intended, quote, intended mistake, unquote, where the intention is not a phenomenal thing within the subject. And as I said, it will be very clumsy because I can't really explain this. I have thought again and again that if this extraordinarily bold way of perceiving the double bind between knowing and doing, not just knowing and doing, but the practical reason is something like that. Please forgive this vulgarization. If this way, this developed idea could be brought into all of the moments in Gramsci that Ursula has so beautifully laid out that I don't have to do that work, the idea of I must change myself when he's talking about psychoanalysis, and then coming to the historical moment when he says, I am now transformed. This idea, taking it away from a mere historical narrative, but you can say that, well, mere historical is kind of bold, but I mean, one can say that the historical situation, to an extent, shows the fault lines, even in Gramsci's case, I mean, with so developed an intellect, shows the fault lines of the merely humanist notion of how one puts education into a double bind between coercion and the development of conviction. This is shorthand, but nonetheless, this is a relationship that one might want to think through in a longer frame, obviously. As for the actual stuff on Gramsci, I would have said something about traveling theory, because I think it's fantastic in the context of the Italian freezing of Gramsci at the moment that David Friedberg was describing to me in conversation. It's fantastic to open it up into this kind of gendered margins. This is already implicit in the notion of the production of the subaltern intellectual. I can't go there now. But on the other hand, I think at the same time, it is very necessary as that theory travels to the United States and it travels to a certain kind of Britain, not quite the general intellectual atmosphere, that we say again and again that this is not, and Ursula commented on that when she quite correctly said that I'm completely uninterested in essentializing subaltern speech, that this is not permission to go away from the tight description of the subaltern in the historiography essay, or not quite essay, where he talks about the subaltern being the groups that do not achieve the state, that they do not have the abstract structures of the state are not accessible to them. So I think, like most traveling theory, as Edward Said so cannily commented, we have to deal with this fantastic development in an intellectually active way. Then I would have gone on to comment on the extraordinary affinity that I also see between Giulia and the NKVD and the so-called madness and so on, and Bhuvaneshwari Bhaduri in Can the Subaltern Speak with the anti-imperialist terrorist struggles and then her inability to kill and therefore then suicide. This pattern, again I'm putting it very boldly, but in terms of gendering and in terms of much of Gramsci's critique of the feminine position when he is, and you really, those quotes were wonderful, as he's talking about education, there is much room for discussion there. I don't think I'm going to say anything more except remind some folks in this room that the analysis of Freud's analysis of Dora, of course, is very, Jacqueline Rose has already commented on this, is also striking in that it completely ignores the political activities of the woman he calls Dora. So to an extent we can go there, but I don't think I want to go there. I want to listen to Joe. But I hope you will forgive the brevity of the remarks on Kant, because they're not generally accepted by by readers of Kant. So I hope the Kantians in the audience will help me to understand if it's possible to think the Kant and Gramsci together in that way. Thank you very much. Joe, it's all yours.